Richard Matthews, the billionaire CEO of a global tech company, sat alone in his office, staring out at the city lights beneath him. His sleek, modern office was a reflection of his success, minimalist, high-tech, and imposing. Yet there was an emptiness to the space that even the wealthiest office could not fill. The sound of the city outside buzzed in the background, but inside, Richard felt the deafening silence of loneliness. For years, he had thrown himself into his work, trying to escape the memories of a life he no longer had. His marriage to Alina, once the most important part of his life, had crumbled under the weight of his ambition. They had been young, hopeful, and full of dreams. But somewhere along the way, those dreams faded, replaced by the pressure of growing a company, expanding into new markets, and keeping up with the relentless pace of success. Alina had begged him to slow down, to make time for her, to make time for them. But Richard had thought she was being unreasonable. After all, he was doing this for them, wasn't he? The divorce had been final a year ago, but it felt like it had only just happened. Richard had moved on, or at least he told himself he had. He surrounded himself with work, gadgets, meetings, and new ventures. The idea of relationships, family, or even small talk at a social gathering seemed like something from another life. But that evening, as Richard sat in his office, staring at the glowing screen of his laptop, an unexpected email popped up in his inbox. He glanced at the subject line: Winter Gala Invitation, an evening of elegance and reunion. The sender's name was familiar, an old acquaintance from his business days, Samantha Forbes, the event organizer for a prestigious charity gala held every winter. He had attended the gala once, years ago, but it wasn't his scene. Still, the title caught his attention. There was something about the idea of a winter gala, the twinkling lights, the laughter of people dressed in their finest attire, that almost felt inviting. It seemed like the perfect escape from the monotony of his work. Richard hesitated for a moment before opening the email. It was a lavish invitation, complete with gold lettering and a picture of a snow-covered mansion. Join us for an unforgettable evening at the Winter Gala, where old friends and new faces gather for a night of elegance and surprise. He skimmed the rest of the details. An exclusive event for CEOs, business leaders, and influential figures. The venue was a grand estate, the kind of place that people dreamed about attending. The words exclusive and VIP stood out, and Richard couldn't help but feel a pull. For a moment, he thought about dismissing the invitation. He had 1,000 reasons not to go. His work, the exhaustion, his lack of interest in mingling with strangers. He wasn't one for parties, especially ones filled with people he barely knew. But something about the email felt different. Maybe it was the nostalgia, the idea of reconnecting with people from his past, or maybe it was the chance to break free from the constant grind. He hadn't allowed himself to relax in so long. Richard leaned back in his chair and stared at the invitation for a moment longer. The thought of attending felt strange, almost foreign. He wasn't used to events like this anymore. He had lost the taste for socializing. Yet, as the minutes ticked by, he found himself clicking the RSVP button. Maybe it was time for something different. He could already hear the voice in his head, his old self, the person he used to be before everything fell apart. You deserve a break. You've earned it, Richard. And so, he made a decision. He clicked yes, confirming his attendance to the Winter Gala. As soon as the decision was made, a strange feeling washed over him, part excitement, part apprehension. It had been a long time since he had stepped out of his world of business. He wondered if he would even know how to interact with people anymore, or if he'd feel out of place in a room full of strangers. With a sigh, Richard closed his laptop and stood up. He glanced at the calendar on his desk. The gala was only a few days away. He would go, he thought, just for a few hours, to experience something outside of his usual world. Maybe it would be the distraction he needed. Little did he know, this night, this seemingly ordinary winter gala, was about to change everything. The invitation that seemed like just another formal event was about to lead him into a reunion that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself and his past. Richard had no idea that when he walked into that grand estate, he would come face to face with the life he left behind, a life he wasn't prepared to confront. And so, he began to prepare for the event, unaware of the whirlwind that awaited him. The night of the winter gala arrived, and Richard Matthews found himself standing outside the grand mansion, a towering beacon of wealth and elegance in the cold winter air. The estate, covered in a blanket of snow, gleamed under the soft glow of the lights. The sound of the orchestra played softly in the distance, its notes floating on the crisp air. The guests were elegantly dressed, their laughter and chatter creating an atmosphere of warmth and excitement that contrasted sharply with the chilly night. Richard felt a sense of unease creep up on him as he stepped onto the red carpet that led to the entrance. The familiar weight of his tuxedo, which usually brought him comfort, now felt like a suffocating reminder of the expectations that came with being Richard Matthews, the billionaire CEO. He didn't belong here, not really. He had lived in a world of boardrooms, contracts, and endless meetings for so long that the idea of mingling with high society, even for a few hours, made him feel like an outsider. Taking a deep breath, Richard adjusted his tie and entered the mansion. The grand chandelier above illuminated the ballroom, its crystal lights sparkling like stars. The guests, a mix of business tycoons and socialites, sipped champagne and exchanged pleasantries, but Richard couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place. He had forgotten how to enjoy these events, how to engage in light-hearted conversation without his mind drifting back to the one thing he could never escape: the past. As Richard scanned the room, his eyes landed on a familiar face. It was Alina, his ex-wife. She stood near the fireplace, talking to a small group of people. Richard's heart skipped a beat. She looked exactly the same, elegant, poised, and stunning in a golden dress, with a luxurious fur stole draped around her shoulders. It had been over 2 years since they had last seen each other, and the moment he laid eyes on her, the flood of memories came rushing back. The bitterness of their divorce, the arguments, the hurtful words, they'd all resurfaced. Richard's stomach tightened as he walked closer, trying to calm the rush of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Alina hadn't noticed him yet, and for a moment, he debated turning around and walking back out the door. But before he could make up his mind, their eyes met. "Alina," Richard said, his voice a mixture of surprise and uncertainty. He hadn't expected this reunion, certainly not here, not like this. Alina's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly masked her surprise with a calm smile. "Richard," she replied, her tone polite but distant. "It's been a long time." Richard felt an uncomfortable silence hang between them, neither of them knowing exactly what to say after all these years. Their divorce had been messy, filled with arguments about everything from money to priorities. Richard had been so focused on his career that he had neglected his marriage, and Alina had had enough. She left, taking something precious with her: Richard's family, his future. "I didn't expect to see you here," Richard said, trying to fill the silence. "I wasn't sure if I even belonged in a place like this." Alina's smile softened. "I can understand that. But it's a good chance to reconnect with old faces, don't you think?" Richard nodded, but before he could continue the conversation, Alina turned slightly, motioning to the 4 young boys standing at her side. They were dressed in matching tuxedos, their dark hair neatly combed, their expressions serious yet calm. They were around 6 or 7 years old, their faces strikingly similar. "These are my sons," Alina said, her voice filled with pride. "This is James, Daniel, Lucas, and Adam." Richard's breath caught in his throat as he looked at the boys. His mind raced. They looked just like him. His eyes widened in disbelief. The resemblance was uncanny. Each boy had the same sharp features, the same brown eyes, and the same tousled hair. They looked like miniature versions of him. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. "Wait, your sons," Elena nodded, a soft, almost sad smile on her lips. "Yes, Richard. They're your sons." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Richard felt as though the world had tilted. He stared at the boys, unable to believe what he was hearing. 4 children, his children. He had no idea, no clue that Elena had kept this from him all these years. The last time he saw her, they were still going through their divorce. How could she have kept this a secret? His mind was a blur of emotions, shock, confusion, anger, and a deep sense of regret. He wanted to ask so many questions, but no words came. Instead, he just stood there, looking at the boys, each of them staring back at him, their eyes full of curiosity and innocence. They looked at him like they had been waiting for something, waiting for him. And in that moment, Richard realized that the evening, which had started as just another social obligation, had turned into something far more life-altering. The answers to his questions could wait, but he knew deep down that this night would change everything. The room felt smaller to Richard as the weight of Elena's revelation sank in. His sons, 4 children who were his, who looked just like him, stood before him, their innocent eyes studying him like they were waiting for something. For a brief moment, Richard couldn't find his voice. His mind was clouded, spinning in a mix of disbelief and confusion. He glanced at Elena, who stood there, calm and composed, as if she had prepared for this moment long ago. There was no anger or bitterness in her expression, only a quiet sadness. She had clearly known the time would come when Richard would finally learn the truth, but seeing him like this, standing in front of his own children, made her feel a deep, unspoken sorrow. How could you keep this from me?" Richard finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse. "Why didn't you tell me about them? Why didn't you tell me I had kids?" Elena's eyes softened, but the hurt in them was unmistakable. "I never wanted to keep them from you, Richard," she said quietly. I wanted to protect them. Protect all of us. When we divorced, it wasn't just the end of our marriage. It felt like the end of everything. You were so focused on your career, so immersed in your business world, that I couldn't bring myself to tell you. It didn't feel right, not when you weren't here, not when you didn't seem to care about anything outside of that world. Richard felt his chest tighten. He knew she was right. He had been so consumed by work, so obsessed with building his empire, that he had ignored the most important thing in his life. Elena had asked him time and time again to slow down, to prioritize their family, but he had refused. He thought he was doing it all for them, working long hours, making money, planning a future. But in the end, he had destroyed that future. The very future he thought he was securing had slipped through his fingers. "Elena, I didn't know," Richard said, his voice now a whisper, filled with regret. "I didn't know how much I was losing. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was blind to what mattered most." Elena's gaze was steady, and for a moment, Richard saw the woman she had been when they first met, strong, compassionate, yet vulnerable. "I know you didn't know, but when you left, when you walked away, I was left to pick up the pieces. The boys were born just after the divorce. It was hard, Richard, really hard. And every time I thought about reaching out, I thought, will he even care? Will he even want to be a part of their lives?" Richard closed his eyes, the truth crashing down on him like a wave. He hadn't known, hadn't even considered the consequences of his actions, the depth of Elena's pain. He had been so focused on his ambitions, so driven by success, that he never stopped to think about the lives he was affecting. Elena had been carrying this burden alone, raising their sons without any support from him. His sons, his flesh and blood. He turned to look at the boys again. They were standing quietly, their faces a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. It was as if they were waiting for him to make a move, to say something, to acknowledge them. He could feel their gaze on him, but he didn't know what to say. Words seemed so empty now. How could he explain to them that he had missed out on so much of their lives, that he had never even known they existed until now? "I should have been there for you," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have been there for all of you. I failed you." Elena reached out and gently touched his arm. "Richard, it's not too late. They're still young. They need you now more than ever. They need to know who you are." Richard's eyes filled with tears. It was a cruel twist of fate. He had everything: a fortune, success, a name that was recognized worldwide. But he had lost the most important thing of all: his family. And now, standing in front of him were 4 boys who were his sons, who had waited their whole lives for this moment. But the real truth hit him harder than anything else. Elena had raised them alone, without his help, without his guidance. He had no right to just walk back in and expect everything to be fine. He had to earn their trust, earn his place in their lives. And that wasn't going to be easy. Elena, noticing the turmoil in his expression, took a step closer. "It won't be easy, Richard," she said softly. "But they've always known about you. I never lied to them. I told them their father was out there, somewhere, working hard. And one day, we'd see him again." Richard nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. This was his reality now. The path he had chosen all those years ago had led him here. But maybe, just maybe, this was his chance to do something right, to fix the mistakes he had made. It wasn't going to be easy, but he couldn't ignore it anymore. It was time to be the father he should have been all along. As he looked at the boys again, Richard knew this was the beginning of something new. But whether it would be enough to repair the damage done, only time would tell. The rest of the evening passed in a blur for Richard. After Elena's revelation, everything had shifted. The grand ballroom, the laughter, the soft melodies of the orchestra, all seemed distant now. He couldn't think of anything other than the 4 boys who, for the first time, called him Dad. They were his sons, and though he had missed their entire lives up until this point, the fact that they stood in front of him felt like fate's way of giving him a second chance. The moment had been overwhelming. Elena had explained how the boys had always known about him. She kept them in the loop, telling them stories about their father, about how he worked tirelessly to build a life for them. Though he was never there to witness their milestones, she had shielded them from the pain of his absence, but the truth of it had never been lost on them. Now, standing here, in front of their father, they waited for him to take the first step. They were so young, and yet their eyes were filled with hope and anticipation, as if they had been waiting for this moment their entire lives. Richard didn't know how to begin. He was lost in a sea of regret, guilt, and longing. But he knew one thing. This was his moment to change, to make things right. The past couldn't be erased, but the future was still open. The boys, sensing his hesitation, took the first step themselves. James, the eldest of the 4, took a step forward, and without saying a word, hugged Richard tightly. It was an innocent gesture, but for Richard, it was a powerful one. His heart swelled with emotion as he wrapped his arms around James, feeling the warmth of his son's embrace for the first time. James pulled back slightly and looked up at him, a soft smile on his face. "We've been waiting for you, Dad," he said simply. Richard's throat tightened, and he could barely manage to speak. The words he had wanted to say for so long were stuck, lodged in his chest like a heavy stone. But he didn't need to say anything just yet. His son's embrace spoke volumes. He was here now. He was ready to be part of their lives. Next, Daniel stepped forward. He was quieter than James, more reserved, but there was a warmth in his eyes that Richard couldn't ignore. Daniel reached out, offering Richard a small, tentative hug. "It's good to meet you, Dad," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. Richard smiled through his tears. He was finally meeting his children, finally holding them in his arms. Lucas and Adam, the younger twins, were next. They were full of energy, their excitement palpable. They raced toward Richard and jumped into his arms, laughing as he caught them both. It was a moment that Richard had never thought he would experience, the laughter of his own children filling his heart, a sound he had missed without even realizing it. They chattered excitedly about all the things they'd wanted to do with him, from teaching him to play soccer to showing him their school projects. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and for the first time in years, Richard felt truly alive. He felt like he was part of something real, something bigger than just himself and his work. Elena stood to the side, watching the reunion unfold with a quiet smile. She had always known this day would come, but seeing it happen, seeing the boys embrace their father with such open hearts, filled her with a sense of peace. It wasn't perfect, and there was much to rebuild, but this was the beginning of something beautiful. She had always believed that Richard was capable of more, of being the man he used to be, the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago, and now she could see it in him again. For the first time, Richard didn't feel the weight of his past mistakes hanging over him. He didn't feel like a failure. As he looked at his sons, at the family he had missed, he felt something shift inside him. The regret that had plagued him all evening began to fade, replaced by a deep, overwhelming love. He had the chance to be the father they needed, the father he had always wanted to be. As the night went on, Richard and his sons talked, laughed, and played. They walked outside into the snowy night, making snow angels and having snowball fights. Elena, watching from a distance, couldn't help but feel a wave of gratitude. She had raised her boys on her own, but she had always known that this day, this reunion, was possible. And now, it was happening. As the evening drew to a close, Richard realized that this wasn't just a reunion. It was the beginning of a new chapter. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, and he would have to prove himself to his sons, to Elena, and to himself. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. The past could never be changed, but the future was wide open. With a smile, Richard hugged his sons one last time that night, feeling the warmth of their love in his arms. He didn't know what the future would hold, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going to let them slip away again. He had a family now, and he was going to fight to be the father they deserved. It was the start of something new, a heartwarming reunion, one that would heal the wounds of the past and build a future filled with love, forgiveness, and second chances.